The afternoon air over Manhattan carried the easy warmth of early summer, the kind that softened the edges of the city and slowed even the most hurried footsteps. June 28, 1971, did not announce itself as a day of violence. It arrived quietly, with sunlight glinting off car windshields and the low hum of traffic circling Columbus Circle. Families gathered near the stone monument, men in short sleeves leaned against railings, and banners fluttered gently in the breeze, printed with slogans about heritage, pride, and unity. It was meant to be a peaceful rally, almost celebratory in tone, a public expression of Italian-American identity at a time when suspicion and stereotypes still lingered heavily in the American imagination. At the center of it all was Joe Colombo, a man whose name carried weight in two very different worlds. To the crowd, he was a well-dressed organizer, a confident speaker, a defender of civil rights who spoke openly about discrimination and dignity. To others, those who watched from a distance, from parked cars or shaded doorways, he was something else entirely. He was a mafia boss, the head of one of New York's 5 families, a man who had spent decades rising through a criminal system built on secrecy, silence, and fear. The contradiction was striking. In a world where mafia power traditionally survived by remaining unseen, Colombo stood beneath the open sky, microphones placed before him, his voice carried freely through loudspeakers. As the rally unfolded, nothing appeared out of place. Colombo moved calmly among supporters, shaking hands, exchanging smiles, offering reassuring words. He seemed relaxed, almost content, as though the dangers that had shaped his life had finally loosened their grip. For years, he had lived under the weight of unspoken rules: never draw attention, never invite scrutiny, never confuse influence with visibility. And yet, here he was, doing precisely that. It was a gamble, one he had taken knowingly, believing that public legitimacy could shield him where shadows once had. The crowd listened as speakers praised cultural pride and condemned unfair treatment. The tone was earnest, even gentle. Children sat on shoulders, older men nodded thoughtfully, and passers-by slowed to watch. There was no sense of imminent danger, no collective intake of breath that warned of what was about to come. The city moved as it always did, indifferent to the invisible tensions threading through the gathering. Then, without warning, a single sharp sound cut through the summer air. It was not loud enough at first to register as chaos. Some thought it was a firecracker, others a car backfiring on the nearby street. But within seconds, confusion rippled outward. Joe Colombo staggered, his body betraying him in a way it never had before, and he fell forward onto the pavement. Blood spread quickly, dark against the pale stone, while screams rose from the crowd. The calm that had settled over Columbus Circle shattered completely, replaced by panic, disbelief, and raw fear. In the immediate aftermath, time seemed to slow. People froze where they stood, unsure whether to run or remain still. Security rushed forward. A man in the crowd, later identified as Jerome Johnson, was shot dead almost instantly by Colombo's guards. Within moments, the rally that had promised unity dissolved into sirens, shouting, and the heavy presence of police. Joe Colombo was rushed to the hospital, his fate uncertain, suspended between life and death. That single gunshot echoed far beyond the circle that day. It reverberated through the tightly controlled underworld of organized crime, through FBI offices already thick with surveillance files, and through neighborhoods where Colombo's name had been spoken with both respect and fear. The attempt on his life was not just an act of violence, it was a statement, a rupture, a question posed to an entire system built on unspoken understandings. Who would dare strike a mafia boss so openly? And why, at this moment, in full view of the public? To understand how Joe Colombo ended up bleeding on a city sidewalk, one must move backward through time, into the quieter spaces of his life, long before the microphones and banners. His story is not one of sudden ambition or reckless bravado, but of gradual ascent, careful alliances, and a deep understanding of power as something that must be managed, not flaunted. Colombo had survived internal mafia wars, shifting loyalties, and the constant threat of betrayal. He had learned, early on, that the most dangerous moments were often the calmest ones. Yet something had changed. By 1971, Colombo was no longer content to operate entirely in the shadows. He had convinced himself, and perhaps those closest to him, that public visibility could serve as protection. By aligning himself with a legitimate cause, by positioning himself as a spokesman rather than a criminal, he believed he could reshape how he was seen, both by law enforcement and by rival bosses. It was a radical idea in a world governed by tradition, and not everyone approved. The mafia thrived on predictability. It relied on rules passed down quietly, enforced subtly, and broken only at great cost. Colombo's public crusade disrupted that balance. His creation of the Italian-American Civil Rights League drew attention not only from the media but from the FBI, whose agents now had a clear focal point for their investigations. More troubling, it unsettled other mafia leaders, men who had built empires precisely by avoiding the spotlight. In their eyes, Colombo's actions were not brave, they were dangerous. As Colombo lay unconscious in a hospital bed, machines breathing for him, his world began to shift without him. Decisions were made, alliances tested, and long-simmering resentments surfaced. The man who had stood at the center of attention was now silent, unable to speak for himself, unable to command loyalty or fear. His body lived on, but his authority did not. For the public, the shooting became a moment of fascination and confusion. Newspapers struggled to frame the event. Was Colombo a civil rights leader attacked for his activism, or a mob boss caught up in the violence of his own world? The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Joe Colombo had spent his life navigating contradictions, family man and criminal, protector and enforcer, reformer and traditionalist. That duality made him powerful, but it also made him vulnerable. As night fell over New York City on June 28, the streets returned to their usual rhythm. Traffic flowed, lights flickered on in apartment windows, and Columbus Circle was cleaned and cleared. Yet something lingered in the air, an unease that could not be swept away. The gunshot that struck Joe Colombo did more than wound a man, it exposed fractures in a system that preferred to remain invisible. This story begins not with his birth or his first crime, but with that moment of stillness after violence, when questions outnumber answers and certainty dissolves. To understand Joe Colombo, the power he held, the paranoia that followed him, and the family he left behind, we must return to the quieter streets of his youth, where ambition first took shape and the rules of survival were learned slowly, carefully, and at great cost. Long before microphones, crowds, and flashing cameras entered his life, Joe Colombo existed in a much quieter world, shaped by routines, traditions, and unspoken expectations. He was born Joseph Colombo on June 16, 1923, into an Italian-American family in Brooklyn, a borough defined at the time by tightly packed neighborhoods where everyone knew one another, or at least knew of one another. These were streets where children played stickball until dusk, where the smell of tomato sauce drifted from open windows on Sundays, and where loyalty to family was not just encouraged, but demanded. Colombo's parents were part of the great wave of Italian immigrants who had come to America seeking stability and dignity, only to find that acceptance came slowly and often grudgingly. Like many families in their community, the Colombos lived modestly. Money was earned through long hours and hard labor, and respect was something that had to be protected carefully. In these neighborhoods, reputation mattered. A man's word was currency, and being seen as weak invited exploitation. These lessons were absorbed early, not through lectures, but through observation. Young Joe grew up watching older men gather on stoops and street corners, speaking in low voices, sharing cigarettes, exchanging favors. To a child, it was not immediately clear who held power and who did not, but there were signs. Some men were greeted with warmth and deference. Others were ignored or quietly avoided. Joe learned to notice these details, the way conversations paused when certain figures approached, the way disputes were settled without police involvement, the way silence could carry more meaning than words. It was a subtle education, but a thorough one. School offered structure, but not necessarily opportunity. Like many boys of his generation, Colombo did not find academics particularly compelling. What mattered more were the relationships formed outside the classroom, the bonds of neighborhood and blood. Italian-American children often felt separated from the broader American identity, caught between the traditions of their parents and the expectations of a society that did not fully trust them. This sense of being on the margins fostered a strong internal cohesion. You relied on your own, because no one else would. The Great Depression cast a long shadow over Colombo's youth. Economic uncertainty sharpened existing inequalities and reinforced the idea that survival required adaptability. Families pooled resources, neighbors helped one another, and sometimes lines blurred between legitimate work and illicit activity. For young men with limited prospects, the allure of quick money and protection was strong. Organized crime did not present itself as a dramatic choice, but as a gradual drift, a series of small decisions made in the context of necessity and opportunity. Joe Colombo was not known as a reckless youth. Those who later spoke about him described a young man who listened more than he spoke, who observed carefully, and who understood the importance of patience. These traits would serve him well. In a world where impulsiveness could be fatal, restraint was a form of intelligence. Colombo learned when to stay quiet, when to show respect, and when to step back. He did not seek attention, he waited for it to find him. Family gatherings reinforced the centrality of loyalty. Meals were long, conversations layered with meaning, and disagreements rarely aired openly. Older relatives spoke of Sicily, of villages left behind, of customs that still govern behavior even in America. There was an emphasis on honor, but also on pragmatism. You did what you had to do to protect your family. Right and wrong were not always simple categories, they were shaped by circumstance. As Colombo entered his teenage years, Brooklyn itself was changing. The city was expanding, industries were growing, and organized crime was becoming more structured. The mafia, though rarely discussed openly, was an undeniable presence. It offered a framework that mirrored the values many young Italian-American men already understood: hierarchy, loyalty, discipline, and reward. For someone like Colombo, who valued order and control, this structure was appealing. His early encounters with the criminal world were not dramatic initiations, but incremental steps. Running errands, delivering messages, observing transactions. These tasks carried little risk, but they offered insight. Colombo saw how disputes were handled quietly, how influence extended beyond violence, and how power was often exercised through intermediaries. He learned that the most important work was invisible. Those who survived longest were those who drew the least attention. World War II loomed during Colombo's formative years, reshaping American society and offering new paths for some, while closing doors for others. Military service provided opportunity and legitimacy for many young men, but Colombo's trajectory remained local, rooted in Brooklyn's undercurrents. The war years intensified law enforcement focus on organized crime, but they also distracted authorities in ways that allowed criminal networks to consolidate quietly. By his early 20s, Colombo was no longer just observing. He had become part of the machinery, still minor, still replaceable, but increasingly trusted. He aligned himself with figures connected to the Prophesy crime family, one of New York's 5 families. This association would define much of his future. Under Joseph Prophesy's leadership, the family operated with a mix of traditionalism and strict control. It was not an easy environment, but it was one where discipline was rewarded. Colombo's upbringing had prepared him well for this world. He understood deference to authority, the importance of consensus, and the dangers of ego. He did not challenge orders openly, nor did he rush to assert himself. Instead, he built a reputation for reliability. If he was given a task, it was completed without complication. If silence was required, he remained silent. These qualities made him valuable. At home, Colombo maintained the appearance of normalcy. Like many men in his position, he balanced his underworld activities with the rhythms of family life. This dual existence was common, almost expected. Criminality was not discussed openly, but neither was it denied. The boundaries between legality and illegality were porous, navigated through discretion rather than denial. The Brooklyn streets of Colombo's youth did not promise greatness, but they did offer clarity. Life was understood in terms of relationships and obligations. Trust was earned slowly and lost quickly. Power was respected, but also feared. These lessons shaped Colombo's worldview deeply. They taught him that survival depended not on force alone, but on understanding people, their desires, their fears, and their limits. As Colombo moved further into adulthood, the foundation laid in his early years would prove decisive. The patience learned on stoops and street corners, the discipline instilled by family expectations, and the adaptability forged during hard economic times all converged. He was not driven by spectacle, but by stability. Not by impulse, but by calculation. Looking back, it becomes clear that Joe Colombo's rise did not begin with ambition in the grand sense, but with an acute awareness of his environment. He knew where he came from and what the world offered someone like him. In choosing his path, he followed a logic shaped by history, community, and necessity. The quiet streets of Brooklyn did not just raise him, they taught him how to move unseen, how to wait, and how to survive in a world where visibility could be as dangerous as violence. These early years, marked by restraint and observation, would later stand in stark contrast to the public figure Colombo became. The boy who learned the value of silence would one day speak loudly on a public stage. And it is within that contradiction, between his origins and his ultimate choices, that the deeper story of Joe Colombo begins to take shape. By the time Joe Colombo began to move more deliberately into the criminal world, he already understood that nothing in this environment happened quickly or loudly. There were no dramatic invitations, no formal announcements welcoming him into something larger than himself. Instead, there were quiet gestures of trust, small responsibilities handed over without ceremony, and long stretches of waiting that tested patience as much as loyalty. This was how the mafia revealed itself to those it considered useful, not as a single moment, but as a slow tightening of invisible threads. Colombo's earliest tasks were unremarkable on the surface. He carried messages from one man to another, delivered envelopes whose contents he was not meant to ask about, and stood nearby during meetings without participating. These roles were designed to teach more than they seemed. He learned how men spoke when they believed no outsiders were listening, how disagreements were phrased carefully rather than argued openly, and how respect was communicated through posture and tone rather than volume. Every interaction was a lesson, and Colombo absorbed them with the same quiet attentiveness that had defined his youth. The Prophesy crime family, under which Colombo would spend his formative years, was one of the most traditional of New York's mafia organizations. Joseph Prophesy ruled with a firm hand, favoring discipline and loyalty over charisma. His leadership style suited Colombo. There was little tolerance for improvisation, and even less for disobedience. For young men entering the family's orbit, the expectations were clear: follow orders, keep your mouth shut, and understand your place in the hierarchy. Advancement came not from ambition, but from endurance. Colombo proved adept at navigating this environment. He did not seek to impress through bravado or force. Instead, he focused on reliability. When asked to handle collections, he did so without complaint or shortcuts. When disputes arose, he deferred to those above him, even when he privately disagreed. This ability to subordinate personal opinion to organizational stability made him valuable. In a world where ego often led to mistakes, Colombo's restraint stood out. As his responsibilities grew, so did his exposure to the mechanics of organized crime. He witnessed how protection rackets were maintained not through constant violence, but through reputation. Businesses paid not just out of fear, but out of a desire for predictability. The mafia offered order in places where law enforcement was distant or mistrusted. Colombo learned that true power lay in being seen as inevitable, not intimidating. Trust, however, was always conditional. Every man was watched, evaluated not just on success, but on discretion. Colombo understood that survival depended on controlling information. He spoke carefully, revealed little about himself, and never appeared overly eager. Even friendships were managed cautiously. In this world, closeness could become a liability, and emotional attachments were often exploited. Colombo learned to maintain distance, presenting a calm, dependable exterior that revealed nothing of his inner calculations. Law enforcement pressure was a constant presence, though often unseen. The FBI and local police monitored known figures, cultivated informants, and waited for mistakes. Colombo learned early that arrests were less dangerous than betrayal. Prison could be endured, exposure could not. This understanding reinforced the value of silence. When questioned, he said little. When detained, he waited. His record during these early years reflected a man who knew how to move within the system without drawing attention. The post-war years brought changes to New York's criminal landscape. Opportunities expanded alongside the city's growth, but so did competition. Different families vied for territory and influence, and internal tensions simmered beneath the surface. Colombo watched these dynamics closely. He saw how alliances shifted subtly, how loyalty was tested during moments of strain, and how leaders maintained control through a balance of reward and threat. Within the Prophesy family, tensions were already present. Joseph Prophesie's demands for tribute and his rigid control bred resentment among some of his captains. While others complained openly, Colombo remained cautious. He did not align himself prematurely with any faction. Instead, he observed, understanding that internal conflicts were as dangerous as external ones. Choosing sides too early could end a career, or a life. Colombo's patience paid off. Over time, he was entrusted with more sensitive tasks, including overseeing small crews and managing operations that required judgment as well as obedience. These roles allowed him to demonstrate not just reliability, but competence. He showed an ability to resolve problems quietly, to keep money flowing without attracting attention, and to maintain discipline among those under him. His reputation grew slowly, built on consistency rather than spectacle. Yet advancement within the mafia was never guaranteed. It depended on timing as much as talent. Colombo understood this and resisted the temptation to push forward aggressively. He waited for openings created by circumstance, an arrest, a death, a misstep by someone else. When opportunities arose, he stepped into them smoothly, as though he had always belonged there. This approach minimized resentment and avoided the appearance of ambition. Throughout this period, Colombo maintained a careful balance between his criminal life and his personal one. He cultivated the image of a steady, respectable man, blending into the rhythms of his neighborhood. This duality was essential. The less remarkable he appeared, the safer he was. Neighbors saw him as familiar, unthreatening. Authorities saw nothing that demanded immediate attention. Meanwhile, within the underworld, his value was quietly acknowledged. The mafia's initiation rituals, when they eventually came, were less dramatic than popular culture would later suggest. They were solemn, symbolic, and deeply rooted in tradition. For Colombo, they represented not a transformation, but a confirmation. By the late 1950s, the quiet order that had governed Joe Colombo's criminal life began to fracture. The Prophesy crime family, long held together by tradition and fear, was slipping into a period of internal unrest. What had once been a stable hierarchy now felt strained, as resentment simmered beneath the surface and loyalty was tested in ways that could no longer be ignored. For men like Colombo, who had built their positions carefully, this instability was both dangerous and full of possibility. Joseph Prophesy ruled his family with an old-world authority that demanded absolute obedience. He required heavy tribute from his captains and showed little tolerance for dissent. For years, many had endured these demands quietly, believing patience was safer than confrontation. But as profits grew and younger members gained confidence, the imbalance became harder to accept. Whispers of dissatisfaction moved through the ranks, spoken in private rooms and late-night conversations where voices stayed low and eyes watched the door. The first signs of open conflict did not come as sudden violence, but as subtle defiance. Payments arrived late. Orders were questioned. Small factions formed, bound together by shared frustration. Colombo observed all of this from a careful distance. He understood that internal wars were rarely announced. They unfolded slowly, through small acts of resistance that escalated only when restraint finally broke. The Prophesy War, as it would later be known, was not a traditional mafia conflict marked by frequent public killings. Instead, it was characterized by tension, intimidation, and strategic violence. Rivals within the same family maneuvered for influence, each move calculated to weaken Prophesay's grip without provoking an all-out response from the Commission, the governing body of the mafia. This made the conflict particularly dangerous. There were no clear lines, no safe sides, only shifting alliances and unspoken threats. Colombo's instinct during this period was survival through neutrality. He resisted pressure to declare allegiance to any faction too early. While others complained openly or plotted quietly, Colombo maintained his role, continuing to carry out his responsibilities without deviation. This approach was not without risk. In times of unrest, neutrality could be mistaken for disloyalty. But Colombo trusted that his record of reliability would shield him, at least temporarily. Violence, when it came, was selective. A disappearance here, an assault there, each act sending a message without drawing excessive attention. The streets of Brooklyn and other boroughs absorbed these events almost silently. To the outside world, nothing appeared amiss. Inside the family, fear spread quickly. Meetings became tense, and trust eroded. Men watched one another closely, unsure who might be aligned with whom. Colombo understood that chaos revealed character. Those who acted impulsively often exposed themselves. Those who spoke too freely became liabilities. He continued to listen, to observe patterns, to note who gained influence and who lost it. This information was invaluable. In an organization where written records did not exist, memory and perception were forms of currency. As the conflict deepened, younger members and dissatisfied captains began to push more openly against Prophesay's authority. Some sought recognition from the Commission, hoping to force a change in leadership. Others resorted to violence, believing that fear could achieve what negotiation could not. The family's cohesion weakened, and with it, Prophesay's control. For Colombo, the war presented a difficult calculus. Aligning with Prophesy offered continuity but risked association with a weakening leader. Opposing him promised advancement but carried the danger of misjudging the outcome. Colombo chose a third path. He positioned himself as a stabilizing presence, someone focused on maintaining operations rather than escalating conflict. This stance appealed to those who feared the consequences of prolonged unrest. Behind closed doors, Colombo began to be seen as a possible compromise figure. He was respected by traditionalists for his discipline and by reformers for his pragmatism. He had not enriched himself at the family's expense, nor had he openly challenged authority. In a world exhausted by infighting, such qualities mattered. The turning point came when Prophesay's health declined. His illness weakened his ability to manage the family and emboldened his opponents. With his leadership visibly faltering, the question was no longer whether change would come, but how it would be managed. The Commission, wary of prolonged instability, began to consider alternatives that would restore order without provoking further bloodshed. Colombo's name surfaced in these discussions. Not as a firebrand, but as a caretaker. He was viewed as someone who could hold the family together, at least temporarily, and prevent the conflict from spilling outward. For Colombo, this moment represented the culmination of years of patience. He did not seize power, it was offered to him as a solution. Accepting leadership during a war carried immense risk. Colombo understood that stepping forward would place him directly in the line of fire, both literally and figuratively. Yet refusing could mark him as weak or indecisive. He accepted, framing his role not as a conquest, but as a responsibility. His language emphasized unity, stability, and respect for tradition. The immediate effect was a reduction in open conflict. Some dissenters accepted the change, relieved to see Prophesie's grip loosened without catastrophic violence. Others remained skeptical, viewing Colombo as a temporary figure who might be replaced once the dust settled. Colombo navigated these tensions carefully, offering reassurance without making promises he could not keep. Throughout this period, Colombo relied heavily on the lessons of his early years. He avoided unnecessary confrontations, delegated authority cautiously, and maintained open channels of communication with key figures. He understood that leadership during instability required visibility within the family, but discretion outside of it. The balance was delicate. The Prophesy war did not end neatly. Resentments lingered, and rivalries persisted beneath the surface. But the most dangerous phase had passed. The family, battered but intact, began to function again. Colombo's role in guiding it through this period earned him a level of legitimacy he had not previously possessed. In the aftermath, Colombo emerged changed. He had seen how quickly order could dissolve and how fragile power truly was. The war reinforced his belief that visibility was both a tool and a threat. It taught him that leadership demanded not only authority, but perception, the ability to be seen as necessary by allies and unavoidable by rivals. These experiences would shape Colombo's next decisions profoundly. Having survived internal war, he believed he understood the mechanics of control. He had risen not through force, but through timing and restraint. Yet the very skills that had carried him through this hidden conflict would later lead him to challenge the unwritten rules of his world in a far more public way. For now, however, the streets grew quieter again. The violence receded into memory, replaced by a cautious calm. Joe Colombo had weathered the storm, standing where others had fallen. The invisible war had elevated him, but it had also taught him that peace in the mafia was never permanent, only a pause between upheavals waiting to return. When the internal struggle within the Prophesy organization finally eased, it left behind a reshaped landscape where old certainties no longer held. Joseph Prophesy's era was drawing to a close, not with a dramatic overthrow, but with a slow fading of authority. Into this uncertain space stepped Joe Colombo, no longer just a careful operator or a trusted lieutenant, but a central figure expected to restore balance. The transition was quiet, deliberate, and heavy with unspoken consequences. Leadership in the mafia rarely arrived with celebration. There were no ceremonies visible to the outside world, no public acknowledgments of change. Instead, authority settled through a series of subtle affirmations. Orders were followed without question. Messages passed through intermediaries carried Colombo's approval. Disputes were brought to him for resolution. Each small act reinforced the reality that the family now looked to Joe Colombo for direction. With leadership came isolation. Colombo understood that power reduced the number of people he could truly trust. Conversations that once flowed freely became measured. Every word carried weight, every decision rippled outward. He approached his role with the same discipline that had guided his rise, emphasizing continuity over disruption. His goal was not to redefine the family, but to stabilize it, to reassure members that the chaos of internal war had ended. One of his first challenges was managing expectations. Some within the family hoped Colombo would immediately ease the financial burdens that had fueled resentment under Prophesy. Others feared he would tighten control to prevent further dissent. Colombo chose a middle path. He made modest adjustments, reducing the most extreme demands while maintaining the structure that ensured loyalty. This careful balancing act was designed to rebuild trust without encouraging complacency. The broader mafia world watched closely. Other families in New York viewed Colombo's ascension with cautious interest. They were concerned less with his personality than with what he represented, a potential shift in how the family would operate. Stability was paramount. Any sign of weakness or overreach could invite interference from rivals or intervention by the commission. Colombo was acutely aware of this scrutiny. It was during this period that the Prophesy family was officially renamed the Colombo crime family. On the surface, it was a symbolic gesture, acknowledging the new leadership. In reality, it marked a deeper transformation. The name change signaled a break from the past and a commitment to a different future, one shaped by Colombo's vision of controlled power and calculated visibility. It was an honor, but also a burden, binding his personal identity permanently to the family's fate. As boss, Colombo focused on organization and predictability. He strengthened internal communication, clarified chains of command, and emphasized adherence to rules. Violence was to be used sparingly and strategically. He believed that unnecessary bloodshed attracted attention and destabilized operations. This approach earned him respect among those who valued longevity over short-term gain. Yet leadership also amplified Colombo's anxieties. He had seen firsthand how quickly alliances could shift and how easily a leader could become a target. The memory of the Prophesy War lingered, a reminder that dissatisfaction could erupt even in seemingly stable times. Colombo responded by increasing security around himself and by closely monitoring potential sources of dissent. At the same time, he began to consider his place beyond the family. As a boss, Colombo attended commission meetings and interacted more frequently with leaders of other families. These encounters exposed him to the broader politics of organized crime, where influence extended beyond territory and into perception. He observed how some bosses wielded power quietly, while others relied on reputation and myth. Colombo found himself drawn to the idea that control over narrative could be as important as control over operations. This belief set him apart. Traditionally, mafia leaders avoided the public eye, preferring anonymity as protection. Colombo, however, had begun to see publicity as a potential shield. If he could reshape how he and his community were perceived, he reasoned, he might reduce pressure from law enforcement and strengthen his legitimacy. This was a dangerous line of thought, one that conflicted with long-standing norms. In private, Colombo justified this shift as a form of defense. Italian Americans, he believed, were unfairly targeted and stereotyped, and these portrayals made mafia families easier targets for prosecution. By challenging the narrative, he thought he could disrupt this cycle. Within the family, opinions were divided. Some saw his ideas as innovative, others viewed them as reckless. Despite these tensions, Colombo's authority within his own family remained solid. His calm demeanor and measured decisions reinforced confidence. He continued to resolve disputes quietly, often through compromise rather than force. This earned him a reputation as a thoughtful leader, someone who understood that fear alone could not sustain loyalty. The weight of leadership, however, began to shape Colombo's personality in subtle ways. He became more guarded, more aware of his vulnerability. The isolation of command deepened. Even moments of apparent success carried an undercurrent of apprehension. Power, he realized, was not a destination, but a state that required constant maintenance. As the Colombo crime family settled into a new rhythm, the city around it continued to change. Law enforcement agencies refined their strategies, public attitudes toward organized crime shifted, and the media grew more aggressive. Colombo sensed that the old ways were under threat. His response was not to retreat, but to adapt, to explore new forms of influence that extended beyond the traditional boundaries of the mafia. This period of consolidation was deceptively calm. Beneath the surface, ideas were forming that would later redefine Colombo's legacy. His leadership had brought stability, but it had also planted the seeds of transformation. By tying the family's identity to his own name and by contemplating a more public role, Colombo was setting himself on a path that diverged sharply from tradition. In the quiet moments, when decisions had been made and the day's concerns receded, Colombo reflected on how far he had come. From a patient observer in Brooklyn to the head of a major crime family, his ascent had been careful and controlled. Yet with power came a heightened awareness of risk. Every step forward narrowed the margin for error. The Colombo crime family stood intact, its operations steady, its leadership recognized. Joe Colombo had achieved what many sought but few sustained. Still, the sense of unease remained. Stability, he knew, was temporary. And in the calm that followed his rise, he began to imagine new ways to secure the future, ideas that would soon draw him into the spotlight, and toward consequences he could not fully foresee. By the time Joe Colombo had firmly established himself as the head of the family that now bore his name, he found himself confronting a problem that power alone could not solve. The traditional methods that had sustained organized crime for decades, silence, invisibility, and quiet influence, felt increasingly fragile in a world that was changing rapidly. Law enforcement scrutiny was intensifying, media attention was sharpening, and public opinion was shifting in ways that made secrecy harder to maintain. Colombo, always attentive to the environment around him, began to believe that survival might require something entirely new. The idea that would set him apart from nearly every mafia leader before him did not emerge suddenly. It formed slowly, shaped by years of observation and frustration. Colombo watched as Italian Americans were routinely portrayed in films, television, and newspapers as criminals by default. He saw how these stereotypes fed public fear and, in turn, justified aggressive law enforcement tactics. In his mind, this cycle endangered not only innocent members of the community, but also the criminal organizations that relied on blending in rather than standing out. Colombo began to frame the issue as one of civil rights. He argued that Italian Americans were being collectively punished for the actions of a few, that their heritage had become shorthand for criminality in the American imagination. This argument resonated with many who had experienced discrimination firsthand. For Colombo, it also served a more strategic purpose. By recasting himself as a community advocate, he believed he could undermine the narrative that made him and others like him perpetual suspects. In 1970, Colombo took the extraordinary step of founding the Italian American Civil Rights League. The organization presented itself as a grassroots movement dedicated to combating ethnic discrimination. Its language was carefully chosen, measured, inclusive, and deliberately nonviolent. Publicly, it had nothing to do with organized crime. Privately, it was inseparable from Colombo's position within it. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Many Italian Americans welcomed the League, grateful to see someone articulate their grievances with confidence and clarity. Membership grew quickly, and rallies drew large crowds. Colombo proved to be an effective speaker, calm and persuasive, his words carrying the weight of conviction. He spoke of pride, dignity, and fairness, avoiding overt confrontation while still challenging authority. Law enforcement, however, viewed the League with deep suspicion. To the FBI, Colombo's sudden visibility was alarming. A mafia boss operating openly, holding press conferences and organizing mass gatherings, disrupted established patterns. Surveillance intensified. Files grew thicker. Agents attended rallies, took notes, and tried to understand the true purpose behind Colombo's activism. Within the mafia, the response was equally complex. Some leaders admired Colombo's audacity, seeing potential in his strategy. Others were deeply uneasy. The unwritten rules of organized crime emphasized anonymity as a shield. Public exposure, they believed, invited disaster. Colombo's actions risked drawing attention not just to himself, but to the entire system. Despite these concerns, Colombo pressed forward. He appeared on television, met with politicians, and used the League as a platform to challenge law enforcement practices. One of his most controversial achievements was persuading officials to stop using the word mafia in public documents and hearings, arguing that it unfairly targeted Italian Americans. For Colombo, this was a symbolic victory, proof that visibility could produce tangible results. The more Colombo succeeded, the more confident he became in his approach. He began to see himself not just as a crime boss, but as a public figure capable of shaping discourse. This dual identity was unprecedented. It blurred boundaries that had long been kept rigid. Colombo believed that by stepping into the light, he could control the narrative and, by extension, the risks that came with power. Yet the costs of this strategy were already becoming apparent. Surveillance tightened further. Rivals within the mafia grew restless. They worried that Colombo's prominence endangered them all. Meetings became tense, conversations cautious. Colombo's name was spoken more frequently, both in newspapers and in whispered criticisms. The Italian-American Civil Rights League also attracted individuals whose motivations were less idealistic. Some saw it as a way to gain favor with Colombo. Others used it as a shield for their own activities. Maintaining control over the organization became increasingly difficult, adding another layer of complexity to Colombo's responsibilities. Still, Colombo remained convinced he was on the right path. He viewed the League as a form of armor, a way to legitimize himself and, by extension, his family. He underestimated, however, how deeply his actions challenged the foundations of mafia culture. For leaders accustomed to operating unseen, Colombo's public persona felt like a provocation. As rallies grew larger and media coverage expanded, Colombo's visibility reached a level few had imagined possible for a mafia boss. He stood at podiums beneath open skies, flanked by supporters, his voice amplified by microphones. Each appearance reinforced his belief that power could exist openly, that fear could be replaced by influence. But power, when displayed, also attracts attention from those who feel threatened by it. Colombo's rise as a public figure unsettled the delicate balance among New York's crime families. His willingness to speak, to organize, and to challenge authority openly made him unpredictable. And in a world governed by predictability, unpredictability was dangerous. By embracing the spotlight, Colombo had crossed a line that could not easily be uncrossed. The Italian-American Civil Rights League gave him a sense of legitimacy and purpose beyond the underworld, but it also made him a singular figure, highly visible, highly controversial, and increasingly isolated. What Colombo did not yet fully grasp was that the very openness he believed would protect him might instead make him vulnerable. In choosing to go public, he had changed the rules of the game. The consequences of that decision were still distant, still unformed, but they were moving closer all the same, waiting patiently in the spaces between applause and silence. As Joe Colombo's public presence expanded, so too did the sense that he was no longer moving within a single world, but straddling several at once. Each demanded different behavior, different loyalties, and different forms of caution. The Italian-American Civil Rights League had brought him admiration and legitimacy in some circles, but it had also exposed him to scrutiny unlike anything he had faced before. Power that once flowed quietly through back rooms now unfolded beneath bright lights and attentive eyes. Law enforcement responded first, and decisively. The FBI, already deeply invested in tracking organized crime, viewed Colombo's visibility as both an opportunity and a threat. On one hand, his public activities offered a clear focal point, a man whose movements could be observed openly. On the other, his ability to rally support and influence public discourse complicated efforts to marginalize him. Surveillance increased dramatically. Agents attended league meetings, photographed attendees, recorded speeches, and tracked financial contributions. Every public appearance generated reports, every interview added to a growing archive. Colombo was aware of this attention, but he believed he could manage it. He had lived under surveillance for years and considered it an accepted cost of his position. What troubled him more was the subtle shift in tone. Investigators no longer treated him as just another mob figure, they regarded him as a potential disruptor, someone capable of challenging their authority publicly. This elevated him from a subject of interest to a strategic concern. At the same time, rival mafia families watched his ascent with increasing unease. The traditional equilibrium among New York's 5 families depended on discretion and mutual restraint. Colombo's actions threatened that balance. His speeches and rallies drew attention not just to himself, but to the broader Italian-American community, including individuals who preferred to remain invisible. Other bosses worried that his high profile would invite scrutiny that could not be contained. Whispers circulated during commission meetings and private gatherings. Some questioned Colombo's judgment. Others speculated about his motives. Was he genuinely concerned with civil rights, or was this a calculated move to consolidate power? The uncertainty itself was destabilizing. In a world where intentions were usually hidden but understood, Colombo's openness created ambiguity. Even within his own family, reactions were mixed. Many members admired his confidence and the respect he commanded publicly. Others feared that his visibility would bring law enforcement pressure down on everyone connected to him. Conversations grew cautious. Trust, already a fragile commodity, became harder to maintain. Colombo sensed this shift, the way people measured their words more carefully around him, the way meetings ended a little sooner than before. Paranoia, once a distant hum in the background of his life, began to grow louder. Colombo increased security around himself, relying on trusted bodyguards and limiting unscheduled interactions. He became more selective about where he went and whom he met. Even familiar environments felt less predictable. He knew that threats did not always come from obvious enemies, sometimes they emerged from alliances strained by fear. The League itself became another source of anxiety. Its rapid growth made it difficult to control. While many members were sincere supporters, others saw the organization as a platform for their own ambitions. Managing internal disputes, preventing infiltration, and maintaining a coherent message required constant attention. Colombo found himself balancing speeches and strategy meetings with damage control, all under the watchful eyes of the media and authorities. Media coverage intensified the pressure. Journalists sought interviews, eager to explore the paradox of a mafia boss turned civil rights advocate. Some coverage was sympathetic, portraying Colombo as a spokesman for an aggrieved community. Other articles were skeptical, hinting at hidden motives and criminal ties. Each story shaped public perception, sometimes in ways Colombo could not predict or control. For Colombo, the most unsettling aspect of this period was the erosion of clear boundaries. The rules that had guided him for decades, keep a low profile, resolve conflicts quietly, avoid unnecessary exposure, were now in conflict with the public role he had chosen. He found himself navigating contradictions daily, adjusting his behavior depending on the audience before him. This constant shifting took a psychological toll. Rivalries that had once been distant began to feel closer. Other bosses, particularly those who valued tradition, grew impatient. They believed Colombo's actions endangered everyone. While few confronted him directly, the tension was palpable. Meetings carried an undercurrent of disapproval, and cooperation became more conditional. Colombo realized that his alliances were weakening, replaced by a wary tolerance. Law enforcement pressure continued to mount. Raids, subpoenas, and interrogations became more frequent, not just for Colombo, but for those around him. This ripple effect heightened resentment within his family. Some blamed Colombo for attracting attention. Others defended him, arguing that the scrutiny would have come regardless. The division deepened internal strains. Colombo responded by projecting calm. Publicly, he remained composed, his speeches measured and confident. Privately, he wrestled with doubt. He questioned whether he had misjudged the risks, whether his strategy of openness had underestimated the resilience of entrenched systems. Yet retreat was no longer an option. Having stepped into the spotlight, he could not simply disappear without appearing weak. As months passed, the sense of being watched intensified. Colombo began to notice patterns, cars that seemed to follow him, faces that appeared repeatedly at events, unfamiliar individuals lingering near familiar places. Some of this was likely surveillance, some may have been coincidence amplified by stress. Beyond the pressures of law enforcement and the unease within his own family, there existed another force quietly measuring Joe Colombo's every move. It did not issue press statements or conduct raids, and it rarely intervened openly. Yet its influence was absolute. This was the Commission, the governing council of the American Mafia, where the most powerful bosses gathered to maintain balance, resolve disputes, and enforce the rules that kept their world from collapsing into chaos. To earn its attention was rare. To earn its concern was dangerous. For decades, the Commission had operated on a shared understanding that visibility was weakness. Power, in their view, was most effective when unseen. The Mafia survived by blending into the fabric of society, by appearing unremarkable, by ensuring that even when authorities suspected, they could not easily prove. Joe Colombo's public crusade violated this philosophy at its core. Each rally, each interview, each headline chipped away at the protective anonymity the commission valued above all else. At first, Colombo's actions were met with quiet observation. The commission had seen unconventional figures before and had learned that not every deviation required immediate correction. Some believed Colombo's civil rights campaign might fade on its own, dismissed by the public as a curiosity. Others speculated that law enforcement would neutralize him without their involvement. Patience was often the commission's preferred strategy. But Colombo did not retreat. Instead, he expanded his reach. The Italian-American Civil Rights League grew in size and confidence. Colombo's name became increasingly familiar beyond criminal circles. Politicians acknowledged him, journalists quoted him, and crowds gathered to hear him speak. The longer this continued, the harder it became for the commission to ignore. Within commission meetings, Colombo's name surfaced more frequently. Not always in anger, but with concern. Some bosses worried about the precedent he was setting. If one leader could operate publicly without consequence, others might follow. This threatened to unravel the unwritten code that had preserved the mafia for generations. The fear was not just about exposure, but about loss of control. Carlo Gambino, the influential head of the Gambino crime family, was among those most troubled by Colombo's behavior. Gambino was a master of subtlety, a man who wielded immense power while remaining almost invisible. To him, Colombo's approach was reckless. Gambino believed that survival depended on restraint and that Colombo's public persona invited scrutiny that could not be confined to one family. The commission did not issue direct orders to Colombo to stop. That, in itself, was telling. Instead, messages were delivered indirectly, through intermediaries and carefully worded conversations. Suggestions were made. Concerns were voiced. Colombo was encouraged to reconsider the scope of his activities. The language was polite, but the implication was clear: he was straying too far from accepted norms. Colombo listened, but he did not yield. He believed that his strategy served not only himself, but the broader Italian-American community. He also believed that the commission underestimated the changing social climate. In his mind, the old rules no longer guaranteed safety. Visibility, he argued privately, could be a form of protection. By embedding himself in legitimate causes, he could make it politically costly for authorities to target him aggressively. This reasoning failed to reassure the commission. To them, Colombo's confidence bordered on arrogance. They had survived waves of law enforcement pressure by adhering to time-tested principles. The idea that one man could outmaneuver the system through publicity seemed naive, if not dangerous. Worse still, Colombo's success risked drawing attention to the commission itself, an entity that thrived precisely because it remained hidden. As tensions grew, Colombo began to sense a subtle cooling in his interactions with other bosses. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations were shorter, more formal. Cooperation on shared interests became conditional. While no one confronted him openly, the collective body language signaled disapproval. Colombo found himself increasingly isolated at the highest levels of his world. This isolation fed his paranoia. He understood that the commission rarely acted impulsively. When it intervened, it did so decisively and with finality. The absence of overt action did not comfort him, it unsettled him. Silence, in this context, could mean deliberation. He wondered whether his colleagues were merely waiting for the right moment to respond. Colombo responded by doubling down on his public efforts, perhaps believing that momentum would shield him. The more entrenched he became as a public figure, the harder it would be to remove him without backlash. Yet this approach only deepened the commission's concern. From their perspective, Colombo was entangling the mafia with public movements in ways that could not be controlled. The concept of breaking the rules within the mafia carried a weight that outsiders rarely understood. These were not written laws, but deeply ingrained practices enforced through shared history and mutual interest. Breaking them did not always result in immediate punishment, but it marked a person as unpredictable. Unpredictability was intolerable in a system built on calculated risk. As the months passed, Colombo's situation grew more precarious. He continued to operate openly, while behind closed doors, discussions about him became more pointed. The commission considered various options, weighing the risks of intervention against the dangers of inaction. Removing a boss was no small matter. It could destabilize a family and provoke retaliation. Yet allowing Colombo's behavior to continue threatened the stability of all. Colombo, for his part, believed that his intentions would eventually be understood. He underestimated how deeply tradition shaped the commission's worldview. To them, intent mattered less than impact. Colombo's actions, regardless of motive, were altering the environment in unpredictable ways. This period was marked by an uneasy stalemate. Colombo remained in power, visible and vocal. The commission remained watchful, restrained but increasingly dissatisfied. The tension between them hung unresolved, a quiet standoff that few outside the inner circle perceived. In this silence, danger grew. Decisions were being weighed that would not be discussed openly until they were carried out. Colombo sensed the shift but could not pinpoint its source. He fortified his personal security, consulted trusted advisors, and tried to anticipate threats. Yet the true nature of the risk lay beyond his immediate view. The commission's power was not expressed through speeches or demonstrations. It was exercised through consensus and timing. When it moved, it did so with purpose. Colombo's challenge to its authority had not gone unnoticed. It had been recorded, debated, and filed away. As Colombo continued to stand before crowds, speaking of rights and recognition, he remained unaware of how close he was to crossing an invisible threshold. The rules he had broken were not designed to protect individuals, but the system itself. And systems, when threatened, have a way of correcting imbalance, often quietly, and often without warning. As 1971 approached, New York City carried a restless energy that seemed to hum beneath its surface. The city had always lived with tension, but now it felt sharper, more compressed, as though the many forces shaping its streets were slowly pressing inward. Joe Colombo moved through this environment with a heightened awareness, sensing that the space around him was narrowing even as his public profile continued to grow. His days followed a careful rhythm. Mornings often began with meetings that blended the personal and the political, discussions about family business followed by planning sessions for the Italian-American Civil Rights League. Afternoons were filled with phone calls, consultations, and quiet moments of calculation. Evenings brought public appearances, dinners, or gatherings where Colombo's presence was both expected and scrutinized. Every movement felt observed, every decision layered with consequence. Despite the mounting pressure, Colombo maintained an outward calm. He spoke confidently, his demeanor steady, projecting the image of a man in control. Yet beneath this composure, unease lingered. He knew that the visibility he had embraced carried risks that could not be fully mitigated. The commission's silence weighed on him, as did the unease among other mafia leaders. He had crossed boundaries that could not be easily re-established. Security became a central concern. Colombo relied increasingly on trusted bodyguards, men who had proven their loyalty over years rather than weeks. Routes were changed without notice, schedules adjusted at the last moment. Public events were assessed carefully, each one weighed against the potential dangers. Colombo understood that threats rarely announced themselves. They arrived quietly, disguised as routine. The Italian-American Civil Rights League was preparing for one of its most prominent events, an Italian Unity Day rally in Manhattan. The gathering was intended as a celebration, a visible demonstration of cultural pride and solidarity. To Colombo, it represented a culmination of his efforts, a moment to reinforce the legitimacy of his movement and his leadership. To others, it appeared as another escalation, a further step into the spotlight. Planning for the rally consumed much of Colombo's attention. Permits were secured, speakers arranged, and promotional materials distributed. The tone was carefully crafted to remain peaceful and inclusive. Colombo emphasized unity over confrontation, heritage over grievance. He wanted the event to project calm strength, not defiance. Yet even as preparations advanced, subtle warnings emerged. Associates mentioned rumors circulating in the underworld, vague hints that not everyone approved of the rally. Colombo listened, but no specific threat materialized. In his experience, rumors were constant, often exaggerated. Canceling the event would signal fear, and fear, he believed, invited challenge. Law enforcement was well aware of the planned rally. Police presence was increased, ostensibly to ensure public safety. Federal agencies monitored communications, analyzing who might attend and why. The gathering was seen as both a potential flashpoint and an opportunity to observe Colombo in a public setting. Every angle was considered, every variable assessed. In the days leading up to the rally, Colombo's sleep grew restless. His thoughts circled familiar questions. Had he miscalculated the balance between visibility and vulnerability? Were his assumptions about protection through legitimacy flawed? These doubts surfaced in quiet moments, then receded when the demands of the day returned. There was no turning back now. Conversations with close associates revealed a mixture of confidence and concern. Some believed the rally would further solidify Colombo's position, demonstrating that he could operate openly without consequence. Others urged caution, suggesting that the accumulation of tension made this a dangerous moment. Colombo listened, weighed their words, and ultimately reaffirmed his decision to proceed. New York itself seemed indifferent, moving through its routines with characteristic resilience. Streets buzzed with traffic, shops opened and closed, and life continued in 1,000 small, ordinary ways. Yet within this normalcy, currents of anticipation flowed. The city had witnessed many public events, many demonstrations. Few, however, carried the layered significance of this one. Colombo spent time reflecting on his journey. From a careful young man in Brooklyn to the head of a powerful crime family and a public advocate, his path had been shaped by calculated risks. Each step had brought him closer to his current position, where power and exposure coexisted uneasily. He took solace in the belief that his intentions were sound, that he sought not chaos, but stability. On the morning of the rally, Colombo dressed with deliberate care. His appearance mattered. He chose clothing that projected respectability, neither ostentatious nor casual. This was part of his strategy, to appear as a legitimate leader, not a criminal caricature. As he prepared to leave, his security detail reviewed plans once more, routes confirmed, contingencies discussed. The drive into Manhattan was uneventful. The city unfolded around him in familiar patterns. Yet Colombo felt a heightened awareness of his surroundings, noting details he might otherwise have ignored. The sensation was not panic, but alertness, a readiness born of years in a dangerous world. As he arrived near the rally site, the crowd was already forming. Banners waved, voices mingled, and the atmosphere felt celebratory. Supporters greeted him warmly, expressing gratitude and admiration. These moments reinforced his conviction that he was doing something meaningful, something larger than himself. Still, beneath the surface of the gathering, unseen forces converged. Individuals with their own motives moved through the crowd, indistinguishable from ordinary attendees. Surveillance teams watched from a distance, documenting faces and movements. The rally, meant to symbolize unity, had become a focal point for competing interests. Colombo took the stage aware that this moment mattered. His words would be heard, recorded, interpreted. He began to speak calmly, reinforcing themes of pride and fairness. The crowd listened attentively, their presence a tangible affirmation of his influence. What Colombo could not know was how close he was to the edge of a turning point. The careful balance he had maintained for years was about to be tested in a way no amount of planning could prevent. The city, the commission, law enforcement, and fate itself seemed to converge in this moment. As the afternoon unfolded, the tension that had been building quietly reached its peak. The rally continued, the speeches flowed, and the sun cast long shadows across the pavement. In the stillness between words, an unseen decision was about to manifest, one that would redefine Joe Colombo's life and alter the course of mafia history. The afternoon unfolded slowly, almost gently, as though the city itself had decided to pause. The sun hung comfortably above Columbus Circle, casting warm light across the stone monument and the surrounding streets. People continued to gather, filling the space with the soft noise of conversation, laughter, and the occasional chant. The banners moved lazily in the breeze, their colors bright against the muted gray of the city. It was, on the surface, exactly what Joe Colombo had hoped for, a visible, peaceful display of unity. Colombo moved among the crowd before returning to the podium, his presence drawing quiet respect. Supporters greeted him warmly, some shaking his hand, others offering brief words of gratitude. He nodded, smiled, and listened, his expression calm and assured. Years of navigating dangerous situations had taught him how to project ease even when his mind remained alert. To those watching, he appeared confident, grounded, and fully in control. The speeches before his were measured and respectful, focusing on heritage, fairness, and the desire to be seen as Americans without suspicion. Applause rose and fell in steady waves, never erupting into chaos. Police officers stood at the edges of the gathering, watchful but relaxed, their presence blending into the scene. Nothing about the moment suggested urgency or threat. When Colombo stepped forward to speak, the crowd's attention sharpened. He adjusted himself slightly at the microphone, his movements unhurried. His voice carried clearly, calm and practiced, shaped by months of public appearances. He spoke of dignity, of the importance of identity, of the harm caused by careless labels. His words were firm but not aggressive, designed to reassure rather than inflame. As he spoke, Colombo scanned the crowd in brief, instinctive glances. Faces blurred together, supporters, curious onlookers, people passing by who had stopped to listen. This was the reality of public life, the inability to distinguish friend from stranger. He had accepted this trade-off when he chose visibility. Still, the habit of awareness never left him. The rally continued smoothly. Each minute that passed without incident reinforced a sense of normalcy. The tension that had built over weeks seemed, for a moment, misplaced. Perhaps this was proof that his approach worked, that openness did not always invite danger. The idea lingered quietly, offering reassurance. Colombo paused briefly between thoughts, allowing the crowd to settle. It was in this ordinary moment, between sentences, that everything changed. A man stepped forward from within the crowd. His movement was not rushed, not dramatic. He blended seamlessly with those around him, his presence unremarkable until it was suddenly not. In the space of a heartbeat, a gun was raised. The sound that followed was sharp and startling, cracking through the air with brutal clarity. For an instant, confusion reigned. Some thought it was a firecracker, others a mechanical noise from the street. Colombo felt the impact before he fully understood what had happened. His body reacted instinctively, his balance faltering as pain surged through him. He collapsed forward, the microphone clattering as he fell. The crowd froze, suspended in disbelief, before panic erupted. Screams cut through the air, people scattering in all directions. The carefully maintained calm dissolved instantly into chaos. Colombo's bodyguards reacted without hesitation. They moved toward the source of the gunshot, their training overriding shock. Within seconds, the man who had fired the weapon, later identified as Jerome Johnson, was shot multiple times and killed on the spot. His body fell among the crowd, adding another layer of horror to the scene. Blood spread beneath Colombo as he lay motionless on the pavement. His eyes were open but unseeing, his body still. Those closest to him shouted for help, their voices strained with fear. Police rushed forward, radios crackling, orders shouted. The rally that had symbolized unity now resembled a battlefield, fragmented and raw. Time seemed distorted. Seconds stretched unnaturally long as medics were summoned and Colombo was lifted onto a stretcher. His breathing was shallow, his condition grave. The city that had welcomed his voice moments earlier now echoed with sirens. As he was rushed into an ambulance, questions spread faster than answers. Who had done this? Why here? Why now? The killing of the gunman removed any immediate clarity. With him died the possibility of simple explanations. News traveled quickly. Within minutes, word of the shooting reached police headquarters, FBI offices, and the inner circles of organized crime. Phones rang, conversations halted mid-sentence, and attention snapped toward Colombo's circle. The implications were immediate and profound. For law enforcement, the attack was both shocking and ominous. A mafia boss had been shot in broad daylight, in public, during a rally attended by hundreds. This was unprecedented in its openness. Investigators would soon realize that the crime raised more questions than it answered. For the mafia, the message was even more unsettling. This was not a quiet execution carried out in secrecy. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, confusion settled over Colombo's circle like a thick fog. The rally site, moments earlier filled with calm voices and waving banners, became a fractured scene of shock and disbelief. People moved without direction, some running, others frozen in place, struggling to understand what they had just witnessed. The sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the lingering echo of the gunshot that had changed everything. The man who had fired the weapon lay dead only a short distance from where Joe Colombo had fallen. Jerome Johnson, a name that meant nothing to most in the crowd, suddenly became central to one of the most unsettling mysteries in mafia history. His body was surrounded by police and Colombo's security men, their faces tense, their weapons lowered now that the immediate threat was gone. Whatever answers Johnson might have carried with him were lost the instant he was killed. Witnesses later struggled to describe him. Some recalled a quiet man, unremarkable in appearance, blending effortlessly into the crowd. Others remembered only the suddenness of his movement, the way he stepped forward as if guided by an invisible signal. No one could say with certainty how long he had been there or whether he had acted alone. In a world where details mattered, the lack of clarity was deeply unsettling. Police began the slow process of securing the area, pushing back onlookers and marking off the scene. Officers collected the weapon, took statements, and tried to impose order on chaos. Yet the sheer scale of the event made control difficult. Too many people had seen too much, and each carried their own fragmented version of the truth. News spread rapidly. Radio bulletins interrupted programming, television crews rushed to the scene, and reporters began assembling narratives almost immediately. The story was irresistible: a mafia boss shot in public during a civil rights rally. Headlines practically wrote themselves. Yet beneath the sensational framing lay a deeper uncertainty. This was not a typical mob hit. It did not fit the familiar patterns. Law enforcement agencies quickly realized the implications. The FBI, already monitoring Colombo closely, treated the shooting as a critical development. Agents reviewed surveillance logs, informant reports, and recent intelligence, searching for any hint that might explain the attack. The fact that the shooter was dead complicated matters. Without interrogation, motive remained speculative. Within organized crime circles, the reaction was swift and anxious. News of the shooting traveled faster than official reports, carried by whispered phone calls and hurried meetings. Bosses across New York and beyond absorbed the information with a mix of disbelief and calculation. Someone had ordered, or at least allowed, an assassination attempt in broad daylight. That alone suggested a shift in the rules. The death of Jerome Johnson raised more questions than answers. His background did not immediately align with known mafia structures. He was not a recognized enforcer, nor did he have obvious ties to the Colombo family or its rivals. This ambiguity fueled speculation. Some wondered if he had been a lone actor, driven by personal motives. Others suspected he was a pawn, chosen precisely because he could not be easily traced. As investigators dug into Johnson's life, fragments emerged. He was African American, a detail that further complicated traditional assumptions about mafia violence. His presence at the rally, his proximity to Colombo, and his willingness to act publicly suggested planning. But planning by whom remained elusive. Meanwhile, Joe Colombo was rushed to the hospital, his condition critical. Surgeons worked to stabilize him, but the damage was severe. The bullet had caused catastrophic injury, leaving him alive but unresponsive. Machines took over functions his body could no longer manage on its own. From that moment on, Colombo would exist in a state between life and death, present but absent. As Colombo lay in intensive care, power began to shift quietly. In the mafia, leadership did not wait for clarity. Decisions had to be made, territories managed, and potential threats addressed. Colombo's inability to speak created a vacuum, and vacuums invited ambition. Rumors spread rapidly within his family. Some feared retaliation, others anticipated retribution. Who would benefit from Colombo's removal? Who might be blamed? These questions circulated without resolution. The uncertainty bred caution. Meetings were postponed or held in greater secrecy. Trust, already fragile, eroded further. The commission, too, took notice. The public nature of the attack forced a reassessment. Whatever their private opinions of Colombo's actions, this development demanded attention. A line had been crossed, and the consequences threatened to destabilize the broader structure. The commission's silence now carried a different weight. It was no longer just observation, it was deliberation. Public reaction was intense. Supporters of the Italian-American Civil Rights League expressed shock and outrage, framing the shooting as an attack on free expression and cultural pride. Others focused on Colombo's criminal ties, viewing the event as an inevitable outcome of his dual life. The narrative fractured along familiar lines, each side interpreting the violence through its own lens. Media coverage amplified these divisions. Speculation filled the airwaves. Commentators debated motives, potential conspiracies, and the meaning of the attack. Some suggested rival mafia families were responsible, punishing Colombo for his public defiance. Others floated the idea of internal betrayal, a warning delivered in the most visible way possible. Yet the truth remained stubbornly out of reach. Without a living shooter, without a clear claim of responsibility, the case drifted into ambiguity. Investigators pursued leads, but each path seemed to end in uncertainty. In the mafia world, silence prevailed. No one claimed credit. No one offered explanations. For Colombo's family, the days following the shooting were marked by quiet dread. Visiting the hospital, they faced the painful reality that he was unlikely to recover. The man who had guided them, protected them, and made decisions with calm authority was gone in all but name. His presence lingered, but his voice was absent. This absence carried symbolic weight. Colombo had been a leader who believed in visibility, in shaping perception through openness. Now he lay hidden behind hospital walls, his fate determined by forces beyond his control. The contrast was stark, almost cruel. As time passed, the initial shock gave way to a deeper, more persistent unease. The shooting had not resolved anything. It had exposed fractures, intensified rivalries, and left a powerful organization without clear direction. It had also sent a message, though its meaning remained debated. For some, the attack was a warning against breaking tradition. For others, it was a reminder that power, once made visible, became vulnerable. The fact that it occurred in public, before a crowd, ensured that it would be remembered not just as an act of violence, but as a moment of transformation. Jerome Johnson's name faded quickly from public conversation, replaced by speculation about unseen hands and hidden decisions. His role, whatever it truly was, became secondary to the larger question of why Joe Colombo had been targeted at that precise moment. As the city moved on, returning to its routines, the ripples from that single gunshot continued to spread. In hospitals, police offices, and mafia meeting rooms, the same thought lingered unspoken. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a long, quiet reckoning, one that would unfold slowly, shaped by silence, suspicion, and the enduring mystery of who truly pulled the strings that day. In the days following the shooting, the initial shock slowly gave way to a quieter, heavier reality. Joe Colombo did not die. At least, not in the way many had expected. His heart continued to beat, his chest rose and fell with mechanical assistance, and his body remained warm to the touch. Yet the man himself, the presence, the authority, the voice, was gone. Doctors explained it carefully, using measured language that softened nothing. The damage to his brain was severe. He was alive, but unconscious, suspended in a state from which there was little hope of return. This condition created a strange and unsettling limbo. For his family, both personal and criminal, there was no clear ending, no moment of closure. Colombo existed in a hospital room filled with machines, tubes, and the constant, rhythmic sounds of life being maintained artificially. Visiting him became a ritual marked by silence. Loved ones spoke to him softly, unsure whether he could hear, whether some part of him still lingered beneath the surface. In the criminal world, this in-between state was deeply destabilizing. The mafia operated on clarity. Leaders were either alive and in control, imprisoned but influential, or dead and replaced. Colombo's condition defied these categories. He could not lead, but he was not officially gone. His name still carried authority, yet there was no one to exercise it. Decisions that once flowed naturally now stalled. Orders could not be confirmed. Disputes could not be resolved by appealing to the boss. The absence of Colombo's voice created uncertainty that rippled through the Colombo crime family. Some members hesitated to act, fearing they might overstep. Others saw opportunity in the silence. Meetings were held quietly, often without consensus. Senior figures debated how long this state could last, and what it meant for the family's future. No one wanted to appear disloyal by declaring Colombo effectively dead while he still breathed. At the same time, inaction carried its own risks. Criminal organizations that hesitated too long often invited outside interference. Law enforcement monitored these developments closely. Colombo's incapacitation was seen as a potential turning point. Without his public activism, the Italian-American Civil Rights League began to lose momentum. Media attention waned. Investigators noted the shift, recognizing that Colombo's unique role had been central to the organization's visibility. Without him, the League felt directionless. Within the hospital, time moved differently. Days blurred into nights, marked only by visiting hours and medical updates that rarely changed. Colombo's condition remained stable but unresponsive. Doctors spoke of the possibility of reflexive movement, of minimal awareness, but nothing that resembled recovery. Each passing week reinforced the same conclusion. For Colombo's immediate family, the experience was quietly devastating. They mourned a man who was still present, grieving without the rituals that usually accompany loss. Conversations were hushed, filled with cautious hope that faded gradually into acceptance. The man they knew would not return. In the underworld, patience wore thin. Power abhors uncertainty, and Colombo's prolonged silence created a vacuum that demanded resolution. Informal leadership began to emerge, not through declaration, but through action. Certain figures took on greater responsibility, managing day-to-day operations, handling disputes, and maintaining relationships with other families. These shifts did not go unnoticed. Rival families observed closely, assessing whether the Colombos were weakening. The commission, too, watched carefully. Colombo's incapacitation removed the immediate problem of his public visibility, but it introduced a new challenge. Stability had to be maintained. Colombo's hospital room became a symbolic space. Though few outside his family visited, his condition influenced decisions far beyond its walls. The knowledge that he was alive, yet absent, restrained some actions while encouraging others. His name remained a reference point, even as his influence faded. As months turned into years, the reality settled in. Joe Colombo would not return to power. The question was no longer if he would recover, but how the family would move forward without him. Gradually, this understanding spread, unspoken but accepted. The Italian-American Civil Rights League continued briefly, but without Colombo's energy and authority, it struggled to maintain relevance. Events were smaller, media coverage thinner. What had once been a bold public movement became a quiet reminder of an interrupted vision. Colombo himself remained unchanged. His body aged slowly in the hospital bed, tended by caregivers, sustained by technology. For those who visited, the experience was surreal. The man who had commanded rooms and crowds now lay silent, disconnected from the world he once shaped. This prolonged limbo had a sobering effect on those who had admired Colombo's daring. His fate became a cautionary example. Visibility, once seen as a potential shield, now appeared fragile. Power that stepped into the light could be struck down and left powerless in the most literal sense. In the quiet rhythm of hospital machines, Colombo's story entered a long pause. Not an ending, but a suspension. Decisions continued to be made in his absence, alliances shifted, and the world moved on. Yet the unresolved nature of his condition lingered, a reminder of how abruptly control could be taken away. Years would pass before Colombo's life truly ended. Until then, he existed as a shadow of himself, a living symbol of ambition interrupted. His silence spoke volumes, echoing through the family that bore his name and the criminal world that had watched his rise. In this state between life and death, Joe Colombo no longer shaped events directly. Instead, he became part of the environment, a constant presence in the background of every decision, every calculation. His absence was felt precisely because it could not be fully acknowledged. And so the story moved forward without him, shaped by those who remained, haunted by the image of a man who had reached for visibility and been frozen in time. The years of silence that followed were not merely a medical condition, but a long, drawn-out transition, one that would eventually redefine the Colombo family and the meaning of power itself. With Joe Colombo confined to a hospital bed and unable to speak, the Colombo crime family entered one of the most uncertain periods in its history. There was no announcement, no formal declaration of change, only a gradual realization that the man whose name the family carried could no longer guide it. In the mafia, such uncertainty was dangerous. Power thrived on clarity, and without it, tension crept into every conversation and decision. At first, there was hesitation. Senior members were cautious, aware that Colombo was still technically alive. Declaring a new leader too soon could be interpreted as betrayal, a violation of loyalty that carried serious consequences. At the same time, daily operations could not simply pause. Money still had to be collected, disputes settled, alliances maintained. The family existed in a delicate balance, moving forward while pretending not to move at all. Informal authority began to surface quietly. Certain figures took on greater responsibility, not by proclamation, but by necessity. They handled meetings, spoke with other families, and made decisions that once would have required Colombo's approval. This shift was subtle, often unspoken, but unmistakable to those within the organization. Influence was redistributing itself, guided by pragmatism rather than tradition. Not everyone welcomed this transition. Some members remained fiercely loyal to Colombo, holding on to the belief that his survival, however limited, demanded respect. They resisted any attempt to formalize new leadership, arguing that the family owed him patience. Others saw this loyalty as impractical, even dangerous. In their view, hesitation invited chaos, and chaos invited outside intervention. These opposing perspectives created fault lines within the family. Conversations grew tense, alliances fluid. Men who had worked together for years began to question one another's motives. Trust eroded, replaced by quiet calculation. Each action was scrutinized for hidden intent. In such an atmosphere, even routine business carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Rival families observed closely. The Colombo family's internal uncertainty did not go unnoticed. In the mafia, weakness was rarely exploited immediately. Instead, it was tested. Small provocations occurred, territorial challenges, disputed arrangements, subtle encroachments. These were designed to gauge response. How would the Colombos react without a clear leader? The responses were inconsistent, reflecting the family's fractured state. Some challenges were met decisively, others delayed. This inconsistency signaled vulnerability. While no full-scale confrontation emerged, the message was clear: the balance had shifted. The commission monitored these developments with concern. Their priority was stability. Colombo's incapacitation had removed the immediate issue of his public activism, but it had created a new problem. A weakened family risked destabilizing the broader structure. The commission favored decisive leadership, even if it meant quietly endorsing a transition. Behind closed doors, discussions intensified. Names were considered, strengths weighed, liabilities noted. The goal was not innovation, but containment. Whoever emerged would need to restore order, suppress internal dissent, and reassure other families. Personal ambition mattered less than the ability to maintain control. Within the Colombo family, the absence of Colombo's guiding presence was felt deeply. He had been a unifying figure, a reference point around which decisions were made. Without him, leadership became contested terrain. Some sought to assert themselves openly, others maneuvered discreetly. Each move risked provoking retaliation or resistance. The Italian-American Civil Rights League, once a source of visibility and influence, became increasingly peripheral. Without Colombo's energy and authority, it struggled to maintain cohesion. Meetings grew smaller, media interest waned, and its role within the family's identity diminished. What had once seemed like a bold new direction now felt like a relic of a different moment. Colombo's condition cast a long shadow. His continued existence complicated decisions. Killing a boss was one thing, replacing one who still lived was another. This ambiguity restrained some actions while emboldening others. It was a paradox that slowed resolution. Over time, reality asserted itself. Months passed with no improvement in Colombo's condition. The understanding spread, quietly but firmly, that he would never return. This realization shifted attitudes. The question was no longer whether leadership should change, but how and when. As informal leaders consolidated influence, resistance weakened. Those who clung to loyalty gradually accepted the inevitable, recognizing that the family's survival depended on adaptation. The transition remained unspoken, but increasingly apparent. This period reshaped relationships within the family. Old alliances dissolved, new ones formed. Men who had once been cautious stepped forward, while others retreated. The hierarchy reorganized itself through action rather than ceremony. The chaos was not explosive, but corrosive. It worked slowly, undermining certainty and replacing it with calculation. Every decision carried added weight, every mistake magnified by the absence of clear authority. Joe Colombo, meanwhile, remained silent, his presence reduced to a symbol. His hospital room was far removed from the meetings and negotiations shaping his family's future. Yet his name continued to influence behavior, restraining some actions even as others moved past him. In time, the family would emerge from this period with a new order, one shaped by necessity rather than choice. But the transition left scars. Trust, once broken, was not easily restored. The chaos that followed Colombo's shooting became a defining chapter, a reminder of how quickly stability could unravel when leadership vanished. The family learned, painfully, that power did not simply reside in a person. It required continuity, clarity, and control. Without these, even the most established organization could drift toward fragmentation. As the years progressed, the memory of Colombo as an active leader faded, replaced by the reality of a family that had survived his absence but been changed by it. The chaos that followed his shooting was not just a moment of disorder, it was a transformation, one that redefined the Colombo crime family and set the stage for the next, more rigid era of control that would soon follow. As the Colombo crime family struggled to regain balance, a deeper and more unsettling question lingered in the background, unresolved and endlessly debated. Who had ordered the shooting of Joe Colombo? The absence of a clear answer transformed the event into something larger than an assassination attempt. It became a mystery that fed speculation, suspicion, and fear, weaving itself into the fabric of mafia lore. From the beginning, the circumstances defied easy explanation. The shooter, Jerome Johnson, did not fit the profile of a typical mafia assassin. He was not known within organized crime circles, had no obvious history with the Colombo family, and did not belong to any established criminal crew. His death at the scene ensured that his motives would remain obscured, leaving investigators and insiders alike to piece together fragments of possibility. One theory gained traction almost immediately, that the hit had been sanctioned by the Mafia Commission itself. To many, this explanation carried a grim logic. Colombo had violated deeply held rules by making himself and his organization public. His actions threatened the anonymity that protected everyone. From this perspective, the shooting was not personal, but corrective, a warning to others who might consider similar defiance. Supporters of this theory pointed to the timing. Colombo was at the height of his visibility, hosting large rallies and drawing national attention. If the commission wanted to act, doing so publicly would send an unmistakable message. The choice of a public venue, in daylight, before a crowd, aligned with the idea of enforcement through example. Yet this theory raised troubling questions. The commission was known for its preference for subtlety. Public violence invited scrutiny and risked destabilizing the entire structure. Ordering a hit that drew such intense attention seemed out of character. Moreover, no official acknowledgement followed, and the silence from other families was absolute. In mafia culture, silence could signify consensus, or disagreement. Another theory focused on internal betrayal. Some believed that elements within the Colombo family itself had turned against their boss. Colombo's public activism had created divisions, and his leadership style was not universally admired. For those who feared the consequences of his visibility, removing him could be seen as an act of self-preservation. This interpretation gained support from the fact that the shooter was killed almost immediately, preventing interrogation. A poorly executed hit would normally invite retaliation, but the swift elimination of Johnson ensured that no trail could be followed. This suggested careful planning, possibly by individuals with intimate knowledge of Colombo's security. However, this theory also faced challenges. Organizing an internal hit without triggering widespread backlash would require commission approval. Acting unilaterally against a boss carried severe consequences. Those who favored this explanation struggled to identify who within the family had both the motive and the influence to orchestrate such a move. A third possibility involved rival families, particularly those who felt threatened by Colombo's growing public influence. His visibility and activism could have disrupted the balance of power, drawing attention that endangered all. For leaders who valued discretion, eliminating Colombo might have seemed necessary to protect their own interests. Carlo Gambino's name surfaced frequently in these discussions. As a powerful and conservative leader, Gambino had openly disapproved of Colombo's public behavior. Some speculated that he had pushed for action, either directly or through subtle influence. Yet, like the commission theory, this explanation relied heavily on inference rather than evidence. There were also suggestions of external manipulation. Some speculated that law enforcement or political actors might have played a role, either directly or indirectly. These ideas, while dramatic, lacked credible support. No evidence emerged to suggest official involvement, and such theories were generally dismissed by serious investigators. As law enforcement pursued its investigation, they encountered the familiar obstacles of organized crime cases, uncooperative witnesses, conflicting accounts, and a pervasive culture of silence. Leads dried up quickly. Without a living shooter or credible informants, the case stagnated. Officially, it remained unresolved. Within the mafia world, the ambiguity served a purpose. By not assigning blame openly, the system avoided escalation. Accusations, once made, demanded response. Silence allowed everyone to move forward without triggering new conflicts. This pragmatic approach favored stability over truth. For Colombo's supporters, the lack of closure was deeply frustrating. They viewed him as a leader punished for challenging unfair stereotypes and believed his shooting was a betrayal of principle. For his critics, the mystery reinforced the dangers of his approach. Either way, the unanswered questions became part of his legacy. Theories continued to circulate quietly, passed along in conversations and reflections. Each version revealed as much about the speaker as about the event itself. Those who valued tradition leaned toward commission involvement. Those who feared internal dissent favored betrayal. Those wary of rival families pointed outward. Over time, the mystery took on a symbolic quality. It came to represent the limits of knowledge in a world governed by secrecy. Even decades later, no definitive answer emerged. The truth, if known, remained buried beneath layers of silence and selective memory. This uncertainty shaped how Colombo's story was told. Without a clear villain, his shooting became less about an individual act and more about systemic tension. It highlighted the consequences of challenging deeply entrenched norms and the risks inherent in visibility. In the end, the question of who ordered the hit mattered less than what it revealed. Colombo's actions had unsettled powerful forces, whether within his own family, among rivals, or across the commission. The response, whatever its origin, was swift and decisive enough to remove him from power without igniting open war. The mystery endured because it served the interests of those who survived. Clarity would have required accountability, and accountability threatened stability. Silence was safer. Joe Colombo's shooting thus remained an open wound, a question mark in the history of organized crime. It lingered not because no one suspected, but because no one dared to confirm. And in that silence, the mafia's greatest strength, and its deepest darkness, was revealed. As the questions surrounding Joe Colombo's shooting faded into uneasy silence, the Colombo crime family continued its slow and deliberate shift toward a new center of gravity. The prolonged absence of its namesake leader had forced adaptation, and by the early 1970s, the direction of that adaptation became clear. Order would not be restored through visibility or public engagement, but through control, tight, disciplined, and largely unseen. Carmine Persico emerged as the figure capable of imposing that control. Known for his sharp instincts and uncompromising approach, Persico represented a return to traditional mafia values. He believed firmly in secrecy, hierarchy, and obedience. Where Colombo had experimented with openness, Persico rejected it entirely. In his view, the events of 1971 had proven the dangers of exposure beyond any doubt. Persico's rise was not announced. Like most shifts of power within the mafia, it occurred gradually, through recognition rather than proclamation. He demonstrated authority by resolving disputes decisively, by enforcing discipline, and by signaling to other families that the Colombos would no longer tolerate ambiguity. His reputation, already formidable, grew stronger as stability returned. Within the family, reactions were mixed but pragmatic. Many members welcomed Persico's leadership, relieved to see clarity replace uncertainty. His style was harsh but predictable, and predictability was valued above all else. Others resented his rigidity, remembering Colombo's more conciliatory approach. Yet dissent found little room to breathe. Persico's intolerance for challenge was well known. One of Persico's first priorities was re-establishing the family's standing with the commission. The Colombos had been weakened by internal chaos and by the controversy surrounding Colombo's public life. Persico worked quietly to reassure other bosses that the family was once again aligned with traditional norms. This effort was largely successful. Cooperation resumed, and tensions eased. Persico also moved swiftly to distance the family from the remnants of the Italian-American Civil Rights League. What had once been a source of influence was now seen as a liability. Public activism was discouraged, and members were reminded of the importance of anonymity. The family turned inward, focusing on operations rather than image. Under Persico's leadership, discipline tightened. Rules were enforced with little flexibility. Those who tested boundaries faced swift consequences. This atmosphere fostered obedience, but it also bred fear. Persico ruled through control rather than consensus, and his authority was rarely questioned openly. Law enforcement pressure continued, but Persico adapted. Unlike Colombo, he avoided public platforms entirely. His movements were discreet, his communications cautious. Even when he was eventually imprisoned, Persico's influence did not disappear. From behind bars, he continued to issue orders, relying on trusted intermediaries to maintain control. This ability to lead from prison became one of Persico's defining traits. It demonstrated the depth of his organizational reach and his commitment to authority. The family functioned under his direction even as he remained physically removed from day-to-day operations. This reinforced his reputation as a strategist who understood power beyond physical presence. For those who had supported Colombo's vision, Persico's reign marked a clear end to experimentation. The lesson drawn from the events of 1971 was simple: visibility invited destruction. Persico's leadership embodied the opposite principle. The Colombos would survive by remaining unseen, by blending into the background, and by avoiding attention at all costs. The contrast between Colombo and Persico could not have been sharper. Colombo had sought legitimacy through public engagement, believing it could offer protection. Persico saw legitimacy as irrelevant. In his view, survival depended on discipline and fear. The family's return to traditional values was not framed as nostalgia, but as necessity. Over time, Persico's approach proved effective. The Colombo crime family regained stability and continued to operate within the larger mafia structure. Yet the cost of this stability was a pervasive atmosphere of tension. Loyalty was enforced rather than earned, and creativity was discouraged. The family endured, but it did not thrive in the same way. Joe Colombo, still alive but silent, remained a distant presence during Persico's rise. His name continued to define the family, but his influence had been erased. In a sense, Persico ruled in his shadow, using the lessons of Colombo's downfall to justify his own methods. The transformation of the family under Persico reflected a broader shift within organized crime. The era of flamboyance and experimentation was giving way to an age of caution. Law enforcement techniques were improving, and public tolerance for visible criminal figures was waning. Persico's rigidity aligned with this new reality. In time, Persico became one of the longest-serving mafia bosses in New York history, his reign marked by endurance rather than innovation. His ability to maintain control, even from prison, reinforced the lesson that power did not require presence, only structure. The Colombo family's return to order under Persico closed one chapter and opened another. The chaos that followed Joe Colombo's shooting had been resolved, but not without consequence. The family survived by rejecting the very ideas that had once promised it a different future. Joe Colombo's legacy, in this context, became cautionary. His attempt to merge public legitimacy with criminal power had ended in silence and paralysis. Persico's rise ensured that such experiments would not be repeated. The family moved forward, steadied by discipline and fear, its path narrowed but secure. And in that stability, the shadow of Joe Colombo lingered, a reminder of a moment when the mafia briefly stepped into the light, and paid the price for doing so. With Joe Colombo incapacitated and Carmine Persico firmly asserting control over the family, the Italian-American Civil Rights League, once the centerpiece of Colombo's public strategy, slowly lost its vitality. The organization had been an extension of Colombo himself, a visible manifestation of his desire to reshape public perception and protect the Italian-American community from stereotypes and discrimination. Without his energy and charisma to sustain it, the League's momentum faltered, and the careful structure that had kept it cohesive began to unravel. The decline was subtle at first. Meetings became smaller, less frequent, and the attendance of prominent figures dwindled. Supporters who had once been energized by Colombo's speeches now found themselves adrift, uncertain of direction or purpose. The carefully orchestrated events that had drawn national attention were scaled back, and press coverage shifted away to other stories. The League, once a vibrant platform for advocacy, became a shadow of itself. Internally, the absence of Colombo's guiding hand revealed structural weaknesses. Many of the organizers had relied on his authority to coordinate logistics, mediate disputes, and maintain focus on the League's objectives. Without him, rivalries surfaced. Minor disagreements that previously would have been settled by Colombo's intervention now festered, undermining cohesion. The organization, which had been meticulously disciplined under his direction, became increasingly fragmented. The media, which had once highlighted the League's activities and Colombo's leadership, grew impatient. Reporters seeking stories of Italian-American advocacy found a movement lacking a clear narrative. Articles that had once praised the League's efforts shifted in tone, questioning its sustainability and suggesting that its vitality had been artificially tied to Colombo's presence. In the public eye, the League began to seem more like an ephemeral political curiosity than a serious organization. For the families and members involved, this decline carried practical implications. Many had joined the League believing in Colombo's leadership and his ability to influence perception and policy. As the organization waned, their hopes for achieving tangible change diminished. Some felt disillusioned, others frustrated, and a few grew resentful that their energy and commitment had been invested in a cause that now seemed directionless. Attendance dropped steadily, and the momentum that had once characterized the League's rallies and meetings became difficult to recapture. The shift also highlighted the contrast between Colombo's vision and the practical realities of sustaining an organization. His approach had relied heavily on his personal charisma and authority. While he had been alive and active, he could maintain focus, command attention, and enforce discipline. Once he was absent, the organization's structural weaknesses became apparent, and no single figure emerged with the capacity to fill the void. Meanwhile, the Colombo crime family, under Persico's leadership, was deliberately disengaging from the League. Persico, focused on maintaining internal stability and protecting the family's interests, viewed public activism as a liability. The organization had drawn unwanted attention to the family during Colombo's time in power, and Persico sought to minimize exposure. Resources and attention that had once been devoted to public events were redirected toward operational security and the careful management of internal affairs. This withdrawal further eroded the League's capacity to function effectively. Despite these challenges, the League did not vanish overnight. Some members remained committed, continuing to meet, organize, and advocate within the limited scope they could manage. There were still rallies and public events, but they were smaller, less impactful, and increasingly symbolic. Without Colombo's presence, the organization lost its ability to command media attention or influence public opinion on a significant scale. Its decline was gradual, punctuated by occasional bursts of activity that could not be sustained. The waning of the League also underscored the limits of leadership that relied on visibility and personality. While Colombo had believed that public engagement could protect him and legitimize his actions, the League's decline demonstrated the fragility of such an approach. Structures built around a single figure, no matter how charismatic or committed, were vulnerable to disruption. Without continuity, the organization could not withstand the absence of its driving force. This period marked a turning point in how the Colombo crime family approached the outside world. The lessons of visibility and public engagement were internalized as warnings. Future leaders would avoid drawing attention, relying instead on traditional methods of control, secrecy, hierarchy, and discretion. The family's public face became minimal, and its operations increasingly opaque. The collapse of the League reinforced the value of invisibility over exposure, caution over boldness. For observers outside the mafia, the decline was noted but not fully understood. Journalists and historians recognized that the League's activity had slowed, but few appreciated the deeper dynamics at play, the interplay of leadership, organizational structure, and criminal oversight. To most, it appeared as a natural fading of a movement whose energy had been tied to a single figure. In reality, it was a deliberate shift, reflecting both the absence of Colombo and the strategic priorities of Persico. The League's dwindling presence had broader implications as well. It signaled the end of an era in which organized crime leaders experimented with public legitimacy and social advocacy. Colombo's bold approach, once considered innovative, became a cautionary tale. The movement's failure to endure beyond his incapacitation highlighted the limitations of merging personal charisma with institutional reform, particularly in a world governed by secrecy and risk. As the Italian-American Civil Rights League faded, the family refocused on the consolidation of power and survival. Persico's leadership emphasized discipline, internal order, and protection from outside interference. Public exposure was minimized, and the priorities shifted toward maintaining influence quietly and effectively. The League, which had once symbolized a daring new approach to leadership, became a footnote, a reminder of what had been attempted and why it had failed. In time, the League's memory became largely symbolic, representing the brief period when a mafia boss had dared to step into the public light. Its decline reinforced lessons about the fragility of movements tied to individual charisma, the dangers of visibility, and the resilience of traditional, cautious methods of power. For those who had been part of the organization, it was a period of reflection, marked by both pride in their involvement and recognition of the limitations imposed by leadership absence and structural weakness. Ultimately, the fading of the League was not merely the story of a single organization losing momentum. It was a reflection of the broader dynamics of the Colombo crime family after Joe Colombo's incapacitation, a return to secrecy, a retreat from the public stage, and the reinforcement of the principle that survival in the underworld depended on discretion, hierarchy, and the careful management of influence. The bold experiment that had briefly merged public advocacy with organized crime had ended, leaving only the quiet, disciplined order imposed by Persico and his allies. Years passed with a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm, each day marking the quiet persistence of Joe Colombo's condition. The man who had once commanded crowds and influenced the perception of an entire community remained confined to a hospital bed, alive in body but absent in mind. For those who had known him, who had followed his rise with admiration or trepidation, this existence was profoundly unsettling. Time stretched, measured not in milestones or achievements, but in monitors, ventilators, and the steady hum of machines that sustained what life remained. Colombo's body continued to function, kept alive through careful medical attention and technology, yet he was no longer a participant in the world he had once dominated. Friends and family visited, speaking softly, sometimes reading aloud or recounting memories. They hoped for signs of recognition, any flicker of awareness, yet none appeared. The silence of his mind mirrored the stillness of a city sidewalk after a sudden storm, the noise of life continuing around him while he remained frozen in place. The Colombo crime family, long reliant on his authority, had adapted to his absence. Leadership under Carmine Persico was now firmly entrenched, decisions made without Colombo's input, operations continuing in the quiet efficiency of a well-ordered machine. Where Colombo had sought legitimacy through visibility and advocacy, Persico emphasized control, discretion, and internal stability. The lessons of the past, the shooting, the chaos, the failed public experiments, were etched deeply into the organization's consciousness. Colombo's incapacitation had shifted the balance permanently. For the members who had once rallied behind him, there was a complicated mixture of grief, frustration, and relief. Some mourned the absence of a leader who had been charismatic, bold, and daring in ways that few others could match. Others recognized that his silence allowed the family to operate without the vulnerabilities his visibility had created. They continued their work, acknowledging that Colombo existed in a strange limbo, present enough to be remembered, absent enough to no longer exert influence. Outside the criminal world, the Italian-American Civil Rights League had already diminished. Its activities had waned in the months after Colombo's incapacitation, and without his presence, the movement lacked direction and purpose. Media coverage dwindled, public attention shifted, and supporters slowly disengaged. The organization persisted in name, but it had lost the energy and visibility that had once defined it. What remained of the League became symbolic, a quiet reminder of what could be achieved through a unique combination of influence and ambition, and of the fragility inherent in any structure built around a single individual. The public memory of the shooting, and of Colombo himself, persisted in different ways. Journalists, historians, and those with an interest in organized crime continue to reference him as a figure of intrigue, a man who had dared to step into the light and had paid a price that left him both alive and absent. The fascination with his life, his rise, and his fall continued, intertwining fact with speculation, legend with reality. In the public imagination, Colombo existed simultaneously as a powerful mafia boss, a community advocate, and a cautionary figure frozen in time. For the Colombo family, the enduring presence of their incapacitated leader became a stabilizing and destabilizing force at once. His name continued to command respect. To speak of him was to acknowledge both his former authority and the void he left behind. Decisions had to account for his existence, even if he could no longer participate. Some actions were delayed out of deference, others reshaped to maintain the appearance of continuity. His silence had a voice, and it influenced behavior through the weight of memory and precedent. The passage of years also brought reflections on the consequences of visibility and ambition. Colombo's approach, bold, public, and unorthodox, had challenged the norms of the mafia and the expectations of the Italian-American community. His incapacitation served as both a warning and a lesson, that public exposure, however well-intentioned, could lead to vulnerability, and that the structures of power in organized crime were more fragile than they appeared. For those who survived him, the lesson was clear: discretion, patience, and adherence to tradition were paramount. Yet even in absence, Colombo's story continued to evolve. Conversations, rumors, and historical accounts kept his presence alive in subtle ways. Each recounting of the shooting, each analysis of the League, and each discussion of his decisions contributed to an ongoing narrative that extended beyond his physical condition. In many ways, his influence persisted not through action, but through memory, shaping perceptions of leadership, ambition, and the costs of exposure. The city itself, ever indifferent to individual human fates, continued to move around him. Streets, neighborhoods, and communities evolved. The era in which Colombo had risen and acted in public began to fade, replaced by new figures, new conflicts, and new priorities. Yet the memory of his shooting, the audacity of his public presence, and the quiet tragedy of his long incapacitation remained embedded in the landscape of organized crime history. Visitors to his hospital room were conscious of this symbolism. They spoke softly, aware that their conversations and gestures were not heard or acknowledged. The act of visiting became ritualistic, an acknowledgement of his former life and influence, and a quiet exercise in preserving legacy. The man who had once commanded attention now required care, observation, and patience in ways that were profoundly humbling. Colombo's enduring presence in this liminal state also highlighted the complex relationship between power, mortality, and influence. Even as his body survived, his capacity to shape events had vanished. The contrast between his earlier assertive leadership and his current inability to act underscored the fragility of human control, particularly in a world where power was both celebrated and contested. It reminded everyone who had known him that authority could be as temporary as it was absolute. Ultimately, the period following his incapacitation became a prolonged meditation on absence and legacy. The Colombo crime family continued to operate, adapted to the reality of life without its namesake, and shifted its strategies under new leadership. The League faded from public consciousness, a casualty of dependence on one charismatic figure. Yet Joe Colombo himself remained a figure frozen in time, a living symbol of ambition, audacity, and the unpredictable consequences of stepping too far into the light. His life, maintained by machines and medical care, became a testament to both human resilience and the inevitable limits of control, a quiet, enduring echo of power lost, ambition interrupted, and a story that refused to end. In the quiet aftermath of Joe Colombo's incapacitation and the subsequent consolidation of power under Carmine Persico, the Colombo crime family began to reflect on the profound consequences of its former leader's choices. Colombo's life, particularly the years when he embraced public visibility through the Italian-American Civil Rights League, became a case study in the intersection of power, ambition, and paranoia. For those who remained active in the family, and for those observing from the margins of organized crime, his story offered lessons that could not be ignored. The events of 1971 and their aftermath became a prism through which the limits of authority, the dangers of exposure, and the fragile nature of loyalty were continually examined. Colombo's ascent had been characterized by careful calculation and patient observation, traits that allowed him to navigate the dangerous internal politics of the Prophesy family and later claim leadership for himself. Yet his choice to step into the public eye represented a dramatic departure from the norms that had guided the mafia for decades. For leaders accustomed to operating in shadows, visibility was inherently risky. Colombo's decision to embrace the spotlight, whether motivated by a desire to protect Italian-American identity or by personal ambition, introduced an element of unpredictability into a world defined by control. The shooting at Columbus Circle crystallized the consequences of this unpredictability. In a single moment, years of careful planning, alliance building, and calculated risk-taking were rendered moot. The sudden collapse of leadership demonstrated how quickly exposure could invert the balance of power. Those who had once been loyal supporters of Colombo's initiatives were forced to reconsider their positions, evaluating whether their allegiance to him remained practical in light of the dangers that had become evident. Paranoia, which had previously been a peripheral awareness for Colombo, became central to the family's consciousness. The absence of their leader highlighted the vulnerability inherent in deviating from established norms. Trust, once a relatively stable commodity, became conditional and circumspect. Every decision, every transaction, and every interaction was measured against the potential for retaliation or exposure. In this environment, caution supplanted ambition, and discipline became the primary currency of influence. The shift in the family's operational philosophy under Persico reflected this transformation. Where Colombo had sought legitimacy and protection through public engagement, Persico prioritized secrecy, hierarchical obedience, and the careful management of perception. The contrast between these approaches illuminated the broader tension between innovation and tradition in organized crime. Persico's methods reinforced the idea that visibility, while potentially advantageous in the short term, carried existential risks that could destabilize not just the individual, but the entire organization. These dynamics extended beyond immediate leadership concerns. Colombo's public advocacy had blurred the lines between criminal enterprise and social engagement. By stepping into the public arena, he had exposed the family to scrutiny not only from law enforcement but also from journalists, politicians, and the broader community. Persico's consolidation, in turn, reaffirmed the principle that survival required operating within the strict confines of invisibility. The lesson was unambiguous: the mafia's strength lay in its ability to remain unseen, to act decisively in the shadows, and to resolve disputes internally without drawing attention. The psychological impact of these events was equally significant. Members of the Colombo family and affiliated crews internalized the consequences of deviation from norms. Ambition, while still tolerated, was tempered by an acute awareness of risk. Strategic patience was valued over boldness. The hierarchy, once potentially flexible, became rigid in order to prevent errors that could be exploited by rivals or law enforcement. The tension between personal initiative and collective security became a defining feature of the organization. Colombo's story also highlighted the paradoxical nature of power. While his decisions had initially enhanced his influence and visibility, they simultaneously increased his vulnerability. Leadership, it became clear, was not solely a matter of charisma or control, it was also a function of timing, perception, and alignment with the implicit rules of the system. Deviating from these rules, even with the best intentions, could provoke consequences that were immediate, severe, and irreversible. The legacy of his choices influenced not only operational strategies but also cultural attitudes within the family. Loyalty, once expressed primarily through obedience, was now intertwined with prudence. Actions were scrutinized not only for effectiveness but for alignment with tradition and risk management. The family's internal culture shifted from one that tolerated experimentation to one that prioritized consistency and reliability above all else. As the years passed and the immediate chaos surrounding Joe Colombo's incapacitation faded, a clearer picture of the man behind the headlines began to emerge. The mythology that had grown around his name, the daring mafia boss, the public activist, the audacious figure who challenged tradition, began to be peeled back to reveal the reality of his character. The contrast between myth and reality was striking, yet neither diminished the complexity of the man, rather, it highlighted the tension between ambition, circumstance, and human vulnerability. Colombo's life had been shaped from the earliest years by the streets of Brooklyn, where he learned to navigate a world governed by rules unspoken but strictly enforced. Observation, patience, and discretion were his earliest teachers. He had absorbed lessons about loyalty, reputation, and survival that would remain central throughout his life. From the narrow stoops of immigrant neighborhoods to the hierarchical world of organized crime, he had learned that power was not merely taken, it was understood, negotiated, and maintained with a careful balance of force and subtlety. Yet even as these qualities guided his rise, Colombo possessed a willingness to defy convention that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Unlike most mafia leaders, who valued invisibility above all else, he stepped into the public eye. His founding of the Italian-American Civil Rights League represented a deliberate attempt to reshape both perception and reality, to assert influence in ways that transcended the traditional parameters of organized crime. The audacity of this choice became central to his legend, the aspect of his life that fascinated both supporters and detractors. Publicly, Colombo projected calm confidence. He spoke with measured cadence, his gestures deliberate, and his demeanor designed to convey authority without aggression. His speeches combined appeals to cultural pride, calls for fairness, and subtle challenges to institutional bias. To observers outside the criminal world, he appeared as a legitimate leader, a figure advocating for justice. To insiders, he remained a man whose authority had been built in shadows, whose skill at reading people and situations was as crucial as any force of arms. Behind this public persona, however, Colombo was deeply human, shaped by the contradictions inherent in his dual existence. He was ambitious yet cautious, charismatic yet private, bold yet aware of danger. These contradictions informed every decision he made, from internal family alliances to the decision to embrace public visibility. He was capable of strategic patience, but also possessed an impulsive streak, a desire to assert influence and test boundaries. It was this duality, risk tempered by calculation, that defined his character. Colombo's incapacitation revealed the fragility beneath even the most carefully constructed power. The shooting at Columbus Circle did not merely remove him from action, it highlighted how dependent his authority had been on his presence. Without him, both the family and the League struggled to maintain cohesion. The myth of Colombo as invincible gave way to the reality of a man whose audacity carried consequences. His life became a study in the costs of ambition, in the risks inherent in challenging norms, and in the delicate balance between visibility and vulnerability. In retrospect, Colombo's public activism can be seen as both visionary and perilous. He recognized the power of narrative, the influence that could be wielded through public engagement, and the potential to protect his community while enhancing his own authority. Yet his vision collided with the established rules of the mafia, exposing him to dangers that ultimately altered the trajectory of his life. His efforts were sincere, strategic, and unprecedented, but they were also unprecedentedly risky, demonstrating the tension between innovation and survival in a rigidly structured environment. Colombo's personal relationships reflected this complexity. He was both a loyal family man and a calculated leader, capable of warmth and charm, yet also capable of ruthlessness when necessary. His interactions with allies were marked by a mixture of trust and caution, reflecting his awareness that loyalty in the underworld was conditional and fragile. He understood the weight of his decisions, and even in public, his charisma was carefully controlled, designed to influence perception without revealing vulnerabilities. The duality of Colombo's life, between the public figure and the mafia boss, also shaped his legacy. The narrative of the bold, visible leader has endured, capturing the imagination of historians, journalists, and the public. Yet the reality, of a man who navigated the dangerous currents of organized crime with patience, calculation, and quiet skill, is equally significant. The myth emphasizes audacity, the reality emphasizes survival and the nuanced exercise of power. Both are essential to understanding who he truly was. Colombo's incapacitation forced the world to confront this duality in stark terms. Alive in body but absent in agency, he became a symbol of both human vulnerability and the impermanence of control. The final chapter in Joe Colombo's story is not one of triumph, nor is it a tale of sudden resolution. Instead, it is a prolonged meditation on power, consequence, and legacy, an exploration of how one life, intertwined with crime, visibility, ambition, and vulnerability, resonates long after the man himself ceased to act. The years following Colombo's incapacitation became a testament to the complexities of human influence, the fragility of authority, and the enduring tension between myth and reality in the shadowed world of organized crime. To understand the final contours of his life is to confront not only the narrative of a mafia boss but the broader lessons it carries about risk, innovation, and the costs of stepping into the light. After the shooting at Columbus Circle in 1971, Colombo remained alive but unconscious, his body preserved by technology and medical care, yet his agency entirely absent. In hospitals across New York, machines took the place of decision, rhythm, and awareness, maintaining the function of organs and circulation, but incapable of restoring thought or consciousness. To friends, family, and associates, this was a paradoxical existence. He was present but absent, alive but unresponsive. The very survival of his body became a form of symbolism, an eerie echo of the authority he once wielded so decisively, a living reminder of what happens when ambition, visibility, and power collide in unpredictable ways. The Colombo crime family, in the months and years that followed, adapted to this absence. Leadership had already shifted to figures like Carmine Persico, who restored stability through strict adherence to traditional mafia principles, secrecy, hierarchy, and a cautious approach to visibility. Persico's leadership contrasted sharply with Colombo's approach, where Colombo had embraced publicity, attempting to merge legitimacy with influence. Persico retreated into disciplined invisibility. The lessons of Colombo's public experimentation became central to the family's operational philosophy: visibility was dangerous, and control required absence from the limelight. In practical terms, this meant the family recalibrated its relationships with other mafia families, reinforced internal discipline, and minimized exposure to law enforcement and media scrutiny. Yet the impact of Colombo's experiment extended beyond the practical management of the family. It reshaped the collective consciousness of its members. The audacity of his public activism and the consequences it invited became a reference point for evaluating risk and leadership. Members internalized a lesson that ambition, when expressed too visibly, could destabilize both personal authority and organizational cohesion. Colombo's incapacitation thus became more than a medical condition, it became an enduring cautionary tale, a tangible reminder of the perils of straying too far from established norms. In mafia culture, where historical memory informs decision-making as much as immediate circumstances, his story occupied a space between legend and warning. The Italian-American Civil Rights League, once the vehicle through which Colombo sought legitimacy, continued to decline during these years. Without his guidance and charisma, the organization lacked cohesion and purpose. Meetings dwindled, events were smaller and less coordinated, and media coverage faded. For supporters, this was a disappointment, a symbol of the limits of ambition when removed from the guiding hand of its central figure. For critics, it underscored the fragility of any movement reliant on a single individual, highlighting the risk of conflating personal authority with institutional durability. Over time, the League transitioned from a force in public discourse to a historical footnote, emblematic of a bold, unprecedented experiment that could not survive its leader's absence. Within the family, the dynamics shifted subtly but profoundly. The absence of Colombo created both a vacuum and a stabilizing anchor simultaneously. His continued existence, alive but incapacitated, was a reminder of his former authority and the loyalty owed to him, yet it also underscored the impracticality of waiting for his return. Decisions were made in his shadow. Authority was exercised with deference to the memory of his influence, yet the practical necessities of operation demanded autonomy. This paradox created a complex environment in which leadership and loyalty were constantly negotiated, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly. Rival families observed these shifts with keen interest. Colombo's incapacitation had destabilized one of New York's 5 families, creating opportunities for subtle encroachment, influence, and negotiation. Yet the family's disciplined response under Persico mitigated many potential vulnerabilities. By emphasizing structure, secrecy, and adherence to traditional norms, the family maintained its position in the broader mafia ecosystem, avoiding major conflicts while consolidating authority internally. The balance of power in New York, while altered, remained remarkably resilient, demonstrating the capacity of organized crime to absorb shocks through internal recalibration. Despite this external stability, the symbolic and psychological effects of Colombo's condition persisted. Members reflected on his life, choices, and the consequences of his visibility. He had been a man capable of remarkable audacity, who challenged both societal prejudices and the unspoken rules of the mafia. Yet his fall, brought about not by incompetence but by exposure and circumstance, served as a stark reminder of the limits imposed by the environment in which he operated. His incapacitation crystallized the tension between ambition and survival, between visibility and discretion, in a way that had lasting influence on those who remained active. Colombo himself, though incapable of action, remained central to these narratives. His presence was maintained through memory, name, and the ethical weight of past decisions. The family continued to operate in relation to him, whether in conversations about loyalty, strategy, or internal governance.